Good morning. Committee will come to order. As we begin this hearing, I want to take a moment to pay tribute to the service of our late Chairman, Congressman Bill Young. America's men and women in uniform had no more effective advocate. We will miss his leadership and friendship. For my part, my working relationship and friendship with Mr. Fiscal, our committee's ranking member, will help fill that loss. Our recent trip to the Middle East strengthens the ties that bind us in our work together. We meet today to begin a series of hearings to examine the fiscal year 2015 budget request for the Department of Defense. We're pleased to welcome the Secretary of Defense, Chuck Hagel, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Martin Dempsey, and the Department of Defense Comptroller, the Honorable Robert Hale. Mr. Secretary, thank you for your service in Vietnam, distinguished service. General Dempsey, thank you for your decades of service to our country since your graduation from West Point. And to Bob Hale, thank you for being the longest continuous serving comptroller for the Department of Defense. And we hear of your retirement, but on behalf of the committee, both sides, and we're unified on this committee, we thank you for your remarkable service and dedication. We're honored to have each of you here today, and we look forward to your testimony. For the first time in years, the committee is operating under regular order. The budget agreement reached in December between Congress and the President means that we can proceed in an orderly, deliberate, transparent fashion to meet our responsibilities to the full committee, the full House, and to the American people. Over the past several years, the practice of funding the federal government through continuing resolutions has seriously affected the ability of both the Department of Defense and Congress to do long-range planning that is crucial to our defense and intelligence responsibilities. Furthermore, the sequester, which the President proposed and the Congress agreed to, has compounded the problem. We must all work together to avoid its return. The committee has, as it always had, two principal responsibilities. First is to provide the Department of Defense and the intelligence agencies with the resources they need to carry out their missions in the most effective and efficient manner. The second and equally important responsibility is to ensure that our men and women in uniform, every one of whom volunteers, have the resources they need to defend our nation and support their families. As a committee, I want to be certain that everyone knows that these hearings will provide all of our members with the opportunity to ask questions they have and get the answers they require to make fully informed judgments about the budget before us. Ladies and gentlemen, we begin these hearings today at a critical juncture for America. The decisions this committee makes will help set the course for America's defense capabilities, not just for the coming year, but for many years to come. And as we consider this budget, we must recognize we still live in a dangerous and unstable world. In the Middle East and throughout Africa, in Ukraine and Asia, and in countless hidden places where non-state actors are planning and plotting to do harm to our country and our interests, both at home and abroad. So among the challenges this committee faces are these. First, how do we use limited resources in the most efficient and effective way? That includes making certain our acquisition process works. Second, what are the risks associated with the decisions we make on the size of our military, the size of our Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marines? And what capabilities, such as the increased use of drones or cyber warfare, do we want our military to emphasize? Third, are those risks tolerable given the threats and conflicts we can responsibly be expected to face as a nation and as a world leader? And fourth, with so many demands and such limited resources, what specifically do we hope to achieve through the 2015 budget? People around the world, our allies and adversaries, are watching to see how we answer these questions. And we want to be certain that our responses reassures our allies and deters our enemies. A budget is, after all, not just about numbers. A budget is, in essence, a policy document. Where we decide to spend our money reflects, or should reflect, our strategies for defending our nation. Those choices also reflect our best evaluation of where the most likely threats to our national security are likely to originate and how we can best overcome them when they materialize. We have heard talk from the administration that it is time for the United States to get off a war footing. Frankly, that troubles me, coming as I do from a state that suffered so much loss on September 11, 2001. Nations around the world saw the manner in which we withdrew from Iraq and the way we are addressing Iran and Syria. They will be watching now how we exit Afghanistan, and they want to know whether America is still willing, ready, and able to lead. When we talk about getting off war footing, it suggests to both our adversaries and our allies alike that the United States has lost its will and its ability to lead. If that's the message we send, we will be promoting greater instability in the world and not less. History is replete with examples of what happens to a great nation when it tires of the responsibilities that accompany greatness. If we withdraw from the world stage, we would leave a vacuum that others whose interests do not necessarily align with ours, are all too eager to fill. But even at a more basic level, history also shows the wisdom of what George Washington said more than 2 centuries ago. To be prepared for war is one of the most effective means of preserving the peace. We must make certain that in meeting the demands of fiscal austerity, we do not leave any question about our will and ability to defend ourselves and our interests around the world. It is not enough to say that the President's proposed budget does not support the military any of us want. We must do everything to ensure that it supports the military we need. We must be creative and innovative in finding ways to rein in spending and make every dollar count, while also meeting our national security responsibilities and providing our military with what it needs to meet its various missions. And we must hear directly from you, Mr. Secretary, where this budget is taking us and exactly what our defense posture will look like in 1, 2, or 5 years from now as a result of it. We must also be realistic not just about our resources, but also about the world in which we live, realistic about the threats we face today and are likely to face in the years ahead, and realistic about maintaining our ability to deter and then, if necessary, meet those threats effectively and decisively. Now, I'd like to recognize my ranking member, Mr. Zlotowski, for any comments or statements that he'd like to make. Thank you.
Chairman, thank you very much. I would associate myself with your opening remarks and ask my entire statement be entered into the record. And gentlemen, would certainly thank you for your attendance today and your service. I would especially want to recognize Mr. Hale, our Undersecretary of Defense, the Comptroller. As the Chairman indicated, this may very well be your last official appearance before the Defense Subcommittee. Mr. Hale, you have helped the Pentagon navigate what I think is probably the most difficult fiscal and financial terrain that they have had to deal with since I showed up in Washington on a congressional staff in 1977. And in all sincerity, I thank you for your service to our country. You have always performed your responsibilities with wisdom, whether I have always agreed with that wisdom or not, discretion, and as a gentleman. And again, the people of this nation have been served well by you. I appreciate it. On the surface, the fiscal year 2015 budget request suggests stability. However, there is much uncertainty and change within an apparently stable top line. The fiscal year 2015 budget clearly expresses a desire to break out of the constraints imposed by the Budget Control Act. This is best evidenced by the Opportunity, Growth, and Security Initiative, which recommends $56 billion in spending above the bipartisan budget agreement, paid for with tax reform and mandatory spending cuts. $26.4 billion of this is proposed for the Department of Defense, and would suggest, speaking only for myself, that those are very questionable assumptions. The request leaves the overseas contingency operations funding unresolved, and I think this is a very serious problem that we face in the Congress with this subcommittee. OMB's budget annex contains plenty of struck language from prior year fiscal year, but provides no new language for fiscal year 2015. The Department of Defense budget does include a placeholder for $79 billion, but also fails to provide justification for this amount. We certainly recognize this stems from the uncertainty in Afghanistan, specifically whether or when the Afghans approve the bilateral security agreement. However, under any scenario being discussed, there will be a requirement for OCO funding in fiscal year 2015, if nothing else for the first quarter. Some path forward must be chosen to provide the support required for our deployed forces. I am very optimistic and happy that potentially we will have this bill on the House floor in June. And if there is not a sentence of justification for $79 billion, you provide us with a very difficult task as we proceed. Finally, the request also embarks on initiatives to control the growth of personnel and health care costs that consume an increasing share of the defense budget. I congratulate you for addressing a very important and difficult issue. In light of failed attempts in the past, I would remark that Congress must be very responsible and not simply react in a politically convenient fashion and be as deliberate in our consideration of your proposals as you have been in putting them together. Again, with the Chairman and the other members of the subcommittee, I look forward to your testimony. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Fiskalski. Mr. Secretary, good morning again. Thank you for being here. Your entire statement will be put in the record, and if you'd be good enough to proceed.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Ranking Member Fiskalski, thank you, and to the members of this committee. We very much appreciate the opportunity to be here this morning, and I want to particularly note General Dempsey's presence, who I have come to have the highest regard for and rely on his partnership and wise counsel during the time that I have had the privilege to serve as Secretary of Defense. And I always appreciate him for what he is and what he does and what he represents to this country. Mr. Hale has been appropriately noted, beatified, sainted, glorified, and I don't think it is an overstatement at all to note what you have each said about his service and the sacrifice he's made to this country. And as Congressman Fiskalski noted, it's probably been as difficult a 5-year run as Comptroller as maybe any Comptroller at the Pentagon has ever had.
He's a Navy veteran, too, so we didn't mention that.
Well, let the record show, of course, that he's a Navy veteran. But thank you, Bob, and I will miss you. We will all miss you. While our focus, Mr. Chairman, I know today is, as you have noted, is on the Defense Department's fiscal year 2015 budget, let me first address, if I might, briefly, the situation in Ukraine. As you know, the administration's efforts have been focused on de-escalating the crisis, supporting the new Ukrainian government with economic assistance, and reaffirming our commitments to our allies, NATO partners in Europe. Yesterday, as you all know, the President met with Ukraine's interim Prime Minister here in Washington and reconfirmed America's strong commitment to the people of Ukraine. Secretary Kerry will meet again tomorrow in London with his counterpart, Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov. And I know Secretary Kerry is here on the Hill today to address some of the more specific issues on this issue. Chairman Dempsey and I have spoken with our Ukrainian counterparts, our NATO counterparts, as well as our Russian counterparts. and Chairman Dempsey and I will meet with NATO Secretary General Rasmussen here in Washington next week. Last week, we put a hold on all military-to-military engagements and exercises with Russia and directed actions to reinforce NATO allies during this crisis. These include augmenting joint training efforts at our aviation detachment in Poland with 12 F-16s and 300 additional personnel, and increasing our participation in NATO's Baltic air policing mission by deploying 6 F-15s and 1 refueling tanker to Lithuania. I know that many members of this committee, particularly Congresswoman Kaptur, have been instrumental in helping the United States stand with the Ukrainian people. And I also know that you all in the House last week took important action by passing a $1 billion package of loan guarantees for Ukraine. In addition, the President has called on Congress to increase the International Monetary Fund's capacity to lend resources to Ukraine. I strongly support this effort because the IMF is best positioned to provide the Ukrainian government and people with the technical expertise and the financial resources it needs. Mr. Chairman, the events of the past week once again underscore the need for America's continued global engagement and leadership. The President's defense budget reflects that reality, and it helps sustain our commitments and our leadership at a very defining time. I believe this budget, as you have noted in your opening comments, is far more, has to be far more than a set of numbers or just a list of decisions. It is a statement of values, it's a statement of priorities, it's a statement of our needs, it's a statement of our responsibilities. It is a realistic budget that prepares the United States military to defend our national security in a world that is becoming less predictable, more volatile, and in some ways more threatening to our country and our interests. It's a plan that allows our military to meet America's future challenges and threats. It matches our resources to our strategy, and it is a product of collaboration. All of DoD's military and civilian leaders were included in this effort: the Chairman, the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, the Service Secretaries, the Service Chiefs, the Senior Enlisted, and others. As we all know, America has been at war for the last 13 years. As we end our second war of the last decade, our longest war ever, this budget adapts and adjusts to new strategic realities and fiscal restraints, while also, something you noted in your opening comments, is focused on preparing for the future. As we all recognize, this is an extraordinary time. I don't believe any of us have ever quite lived through this kind of time. You opened your remarks this morning, Mr. Chairman, saying it's the first time the regular order has been dealt with for some time in dealing with budgets. Rarely have we had so much budget uncertainty, living with continuing resolutions as we adjust to a very large and abrupt set of budget cuts. As a result, this budget is not business as usual. It begins to make the hard choices that we're all going to have to make. All of us are going to have to make some hard choices. The longer we defer these difficult decisions, the more risk we will have down the road, forcing our successors to face far more complicated and difficult choices into the future. Last year, DoD's budget cut was $37 billion because of sequestration. Now, that's on top of the $487 billion 10-year reductions under the Budget Control Act that DoD was already implementing. December's Bipartisan Budget Act gave DoD some temporary relief from sequestration, but it still imposes more than $75 billion in cuts over the next 2 years. And unless Congress changes the law, sequestration will cut another $50 billion each year starting in fiscal year 2016. The President's 5-year plan provides a realistic alternative to sequestration-level cuts, projecting $115 billion more than current law allows from 2016 to 2019. DoD requires that additional funding to implement our updated defense strategy as outlined in the Quadrennial Defense Review. and to responsibly meet the national security missions of the Department of Defense. The strategic priorities articulated in the QDR represent America's highest security interests: defending the homeland, building security globally, deterring aggression, and being ready and capable to win decisively against any adversary. The funding levels in the President's budget let us execute this strategy, with some increased risks in certain areas, and we point those risks out. These risks would be reduced if Congress approves the President's Opportunity, Growth, and Security Initiative, a proposal that would provide DoD with an additional $26 billion in fiscal year 2015 to improve readiness and modernization. We have been in a deep hole in readiness the last 2 years. We've deferred many of our most important future programs to keep this country technologically superior and our forces modern. My submitted statement contains details of this initiative, Mr. Chairman, which I strongly support. Since my submitted statement provides a detailed explanation of our budget request and the rationale behind all of our key decisions, I would like to briefly focus on just a couple of critical issues. First, the relationship between our fiscal year 2015 budget request and our future year's defense program, which was shared with Congress last week. As we all know, Congress appropriates 1 year at a time. And this committee is focused on drafting and passing a defense appropriations bill for fiscal year 2015. The President's FY 2015 budget request fully funds our preferred long-term force levels: 440 to 450,000 active Army, 182,000 Marines, and 11 aircraft carriers. We can do this because the Bipartisan Budget Act gave us some certainty in fiscal year 2015. In fiscal year 2016 and beyond, sequestration returns and remains the law of the land. In developing our future year's defense program, we chose to plan for 2 scenarios for FY 2016 through 2019. One where Congress provides DoD the resources needed to support our defense strategy, and one where sequestration level cuts are reimposed. We had to do this because future funding levels are uncertain. We just don't know how much funding Congress will provide for decades or for defense in our FY 2016 budget and beyond. And it would have been irresponsible for our planning to completely ignore the law of the land. Our detailed planning for sequestration level cuts showed that sequestration would impose some force structure reductions that simply can't be implemented with the push of a button. They require precise plans, longer time horizons in planning. Therefore, our future year's defense program hedges. It projects $115 billion above sequestration level spending on FY 2016 in FY 2016 through 2019, because those are the resources that will be required to execute the President's defense strategy, although at higher risks for certain missions. But even though the future year's defense program projects this additional spending, in its later years the plan includes the sequestration level force structure reductions that take the longest to plan and implement. By the end of 2019, it shows the active Army being reduced to 420,000 soldiers and Marine Corps reductions to 175,000. It also reflects the decommissioning of the aircraft carrier USS George Washington, even though we are committed to paying for its overhaul, and if we receive funding at the levels requested by the President's budget, we can accomplish that. But we had to plan for sequestration level budgets. We are not recommending these sequestration level reductions, just the opposite. In fact, we are urging Congress to provide the additional resources requested by the President. But we cannot ignore the reality that sequestration remains the law for fiscal 2016 and beyond. So we start planning for some of the most challenging decisions required under sequestration. It would be irresponsible not to do so. DoD leaders all agree that our preferred force structure levels can be sustained if DoD receives appropriations at the President's budget level over the next 5 years. and I have codified this in written guidance to the service secretaries and the service chiefs. But Congress, Mr. Chairman, must reverse sequestration in order for DOD not to plan for these large force structure reductions. Next, let me address the balance between readiness, capability, and capacity in this budget request. After more than a decade of long, large stability operations, we traded some capacity to protect readiness and modernize capabilities as we shift to focus on future requirements shaped by enduring and emerging threats. We have to be able to defeat terrorist threats and deter adversaries with increasingly modern weapons and technological capabilities. We must also assure that America's economic interests, are protected. They're protected through open sea lanes, freedom of the skies and space, and deal with one of the most urgent and real threats facing our nation today and will well into the future, cyber attacks. That's why we protected funding for cyber and special operations forces. For the active duty Army, we propose over the next 5 years, drawing down, as I have noted, to about 440,000 to 450,000 soldiers. Mr. Chairman, that's less than 10% below its size pre-9/11. We believe this is adequate for future demand and future threats. We will continue investing in high-end ground capabilities to keep our soldiers the most advanced, ready, and capable in the world. Army National Guard and Reserve units will remain a vibrant part of our national defense and will draw down by about 5%. We will also streamline Army helicopter force structures by reducing the Guard's fleet by 8%. The active duties fleet will be cut by around 25%. But we will still be able to maintain and keep these helicopters modernized as we move from a fleet of 7 models to 4. The Navy, for its part, will take 11 ships out of its operational inventory, but they will be modernized and returned to service with greater capability and longer lifespans. This will also support a strong defense industrial base. That industrial base, as this committee knows, itself is a national strategic asset that we must not allow to let down. The Marine Corps will continue its planned drawdown to 182,000, but will devote 900 more Marines to increased embassy security. And the Air Force will retire the aging A-10, replacing it with more advanced multi-mission aircraft like the Joint Strike Fighter. Now, Mr. Chairman, regarding compensation reform, taking care of our people, as we all know, you are committed to, we are committed to, means providing them with both fair compensation as well as the training and the tools and the edge they will always need to succeed in battle and return home safely. To meet those obligations and under constrained budgets, we need some modest adjustments to the growth in pay and benefits. All these savings will be reinvested in training and equipping our troops. And there are no proposals to change retirement in this budget. Let me clarify what these compensation adjustments are and what they are not. First, we will continue to recommend pay increases. They won't be as substantial as in past years, but they will continue. Second, we will continue subsidizing off-base housing costs. The 100% benefit of today will be reduced, but only to about 95%, and it will be phased in over the next several years. Third, we are not shutting down commissaries. We recommend gradually phasing out some subsidiaries or subsidies, but only for domestic commissaries that are not in remote areas. Fourth, we recommend simplifying and modernizing our 3 TRICARE systems by merging them into one TRICARE system with modest increases in co-pays and deductibles for retirees and family members and encourage them more fully to use the most affordable means of care. Active duty personnel will still receive care that is entirely free. The President's defense budget supports our defense strategy. It defends this country, and it keeps our commitments to our people. However, these commitments would be seriously jeopardized if we don't have the funds and the resources to be able to implement them. My submitted testimony details how sequestration would compromise that security. And the result would be a military that could not fulfill its defense strategy, putting at further risk America's traditional role as a guarantor of global security and ultimately our own security. That is not the military the President, General Dempsey, our leaders, and I want. It's not the military you want. It's certainly not what we want for our future. But it is the path we are on unless Congress does change the law. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, DoD leaders, and I look forward to working with you, all of you, as we make the difficult choices that are going to be required, difficult choices to continue to assure America's security and protect our national interests. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. General Dempsey, good morning.
Good morning,
Thank you
Chairman.
for being with us on behalf of the entire committee.
Thank you, Chairman, Ranking Member Visclosky, other distinguished members of this committee. I appreciate the opportunity to be back here this year to discuss our defense budget for 2015. Before I do, let me comment that I do remain deeply engaged in our efforts to support the diplomatic approach to the resolution of the crisis in Ukraine. I've engaged with our NATO allies, and as the Secretary mentioned, I have spoken several times with my Russian counterpart. And I've urged continued restraint in the days ahead in order to preserve room for that diplomatic solution. We'll continue to maintain that line of communication. I've also recently returned from Afghanistan, where I went to gain firsthand appraisals from our leaders and commanders on the ground. As always, I left there inspired. They remain fully engaged on the missions that we've set before them. We'll be prepared to support a variety of options over the next several months as our relationship with Afghanistan moves forward. This includes, of course, the option to draw down our forces there by the end of the year if that's the decision made by our elected leaders. While 2015 remains uncertain in Afghanistan, our joint NATO team has much work to do this year, and they're ready for it. Russia's recent actions remind us that the world today remains unpredictable, complex, and quite dangerous. We can't think too narrowly about future security challenges, nor can we be too certain that we'll get it right. At the same time, the balance between our security demands and our available resources has rarely been more delicate. And that brings me to the budget. I want to add my appreciation to Undersecretary Hale for his many years of service to the Department and to our nation, and for getting us to this budget. Secretary Hagel has walked you through the major components of the budget. In my view, this budget is a pragmatic way forward that balances as best it can our national security and our fiscal responsibilities. It provides the tools for today's force to accomplish the missions we've been assigned, rebuilding readiness, by the way, in areas that were by necessity de-emphasized over the last decade. It modernizes the force for tomorrow, ensuring that we're globally networked and that we can continue to provide options for the nation. And it reflects in real terms how we're reducing our cost of doing business and working to ensure that the force is in the right balance. As a whole, this budget helps us to remain the world's finest military, modern, capable, and ready, even while transitioning to a smaller and more affordable force. But as I said last year, we need time, we need certainty, and we need flexibility to balance the institution to allow us to meet the nation's needs for the future. The funds passed by this Congress in the bipartisan budget agreement allow us to buy back some of our lost readiness and continue to make responsible investments in the nation's defense. It doesn't solve every readiness shortfall. It's not a long-term solution to sequestration, but it does give us a measure of near-term relief and stability. The Joint Chiefs and I will never end our campaign to find every possible way to become more effective. We'll do things smarter and more efficiently, more in line with the sorts of security challenges that we face today, and in line with fiscal reality. We'll seek innovative approaches as an imperative, not just in technology, but also in how we develop leaders, aggregate and disaggregate our formations, and work with our partners. And we'll improve, we have to, how we buy weapons and goods and services. And we'll invest deeper in developing leaders of consequence at every level, men and women of both competence and character, who are good stewards of the special trust and confidence given to us by the American people, our fellow citizens. But we have infrastructure that we don't need, and with your support, we ought to be able to divest. We have legacy weapons systems that we can't afford, and with your support, that we ought to be able to retire. We have personnel costs that have grown at a disproportionate rate, and which we ought to be able to slow the rate in a way that makes the all-volunteer force more sustainable over time. If we don't move toward a sounder way to steward our nation's defense, we face unbalanced cuts to readiness and modernization. And these imbalances ultimately make our force less effective than the nation needs it to be. We really can't ignore this. Kicking the can will set up our successors for an almost impossible problem. We have to take the long view here. I know these issues weigh heavily on the minds of our men and women in uniform, on their families, and on you. Our force is extraordinarily accepting, by the way, of change. They're less understanding of uncertainty and piecemeal solutions. They want and they deserve predictability. I support the quadrennial defense review on this budget. To be clear, we do assume higher risks in some areas, risks that I have conveyed in my assessment of the QDR. Under certain circumstances, we could be limited by capability, capacity, or readiness in the conduct of an assigned mission. I expect that we'll have more difficult conventional fights. We will rely increasingly on allies and partners, and our global responsibilities will have to be placed in balance with our available resources. If sequestration level cuts return in 16, or if we can't make good on the promises embodied in the QDR, then the risks will grow and the options we can provide the nation will shrink. That's a gamble none of us should be willing to take, because it's our soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marine, and Coast Guardsmen, America's sons and daughters, who will face tomorrow's challenges with whatever strategy, whatever structure, and whatever resources we provide today. Our most sacred obligation is to make sure that we never send them into a fair fight, which is to say they must continue to be the best led, the best trained, and the best equipped force on the planet. That objective has been a fundamental guiding principle as this budget was prepared, and is one to which the Joint Chiefs and I remain absolutely committed. Mr. Chairman, members of this committee, thank you for your support and commitment to our men and women in uniform, and on their behalf, I stand ready to answer your questions.
Thank you, General Dempsey, and let me say that you are a wonderful representative of our sons and daughters.
Thank you, sir.
And let me say, too, on a personal note, you may both be aware that your good Air Force escorted a number of members of this committee, Mr. Visklosky, yours truly, as well as Mr. Moran and Mr. Calvert, over to the Middle East recently. We visited Pakistan, Afghanistan, Qatar, and Jordan. And may I say that our time in Afghanistan, of course, it's truly inspiring to see what those young men and some not so young are doing, serving after multiple deployments. I must say, coming away, this is sort of a personal note from that trip, I'm somewhat discouraged by some of what we heard from talking with leaders in that region about our long-range commitment to the Middle East. Of course, the soldiers have a desire to get out of Afghanistan and back home, but they look around to see and recognize the sacrifices that they've made, their predecessors have made, their predecessors made in Iraq, and they look to Fallujah, the loss of Fallujah, and they have serious questions about where we're going. So one of the things we focused on was the overseas contingency operation, and this is a serious hole in your budget here. I know that you want us to put in a marker in there, but ingrained in that sum of money, which some estimate perhaps would be $80 billion, is some open questions. So can you tell us how we're going to fill that hole and when we're going to fill that hole? I think it's difficult for us to put a bill together with that issue open.
Mr. Chairman, we recognize that question, that concern. As you have noted, and I didn't note except in my written testimony, and I'm going to ask the Comptroller to take us down a little deeper into your question, but the obvious reason is that we held back was the uncertainty of what decision is going to be made about our future presence in Afghanistan post-2014. I think you know, the President has said, it is certainly the advice that we've gotten from General Dunford and from our military leaders, and I support them on this, that we believe we have a role, want to have a role, continued role in Afghanistan, train, assist, advise, counterterrorism, but that has to be done in coordination first with the people of Afghanistan inviting us and agreeing, and that is embodied in a bilateral security agreement, that arrangement. Without that, and without knowing what our future is, it was our feeling that we would hold off and not further complicate an already complicated budget process because of the reasons we've already talked about, and then come back with you, or to you, once we hopefully have better certainty. When we may do that, let me ask Bob Hale to...
Well, we have to be able to go to the floor at some point in time. We have to defend...
We've anticipated it.
We have to defend... You know, when you visit Pakistan and you see the relationship we've had with Pakistan since 1947, and the OCO funds are more than just Afghanistan. They provide resources for the region, and the general statement is that OCO funds will be needed for some time to come, not only in Afghanistan, but in that region. So I'd be happy to have Mr. Hale address it.
Right,
This sort of gets to my critical question, is where are we going?
Okay.
Well, Mr. Chairman, when we get an enduring presence decision, as soon as we can after that, we will get a formal budget amendment to you for OCO. If that doesn't work with the timing this year, then we're going to have to look at other options, and we are thinking of them now as to how we proceed if we don't get an enduring presence decision. I know that's vague, but at the moment I think it's about the best I can do.
Let me recognize the ranking member, Nita Lowy from New York, for any comments she may have.
Well, first of all, I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman. Unfortunately, there are several hearings going on at the same time, and I want to join my colleagues, Chairman Frelinghausen. Mr. Rogers is probably another one of those. Ranking Member Visklosky, Secretary Hagel, General Dempsey, Undersecretary Hale, and the rest of our distinguished guests. Thank you for appearing before us today, and again, I apologize. As we know, the global environment is growing increasingly volatile, with new threats emerging every day, exemplified by the current events in Ukraine, Syria, and Venezuela. In the fiscal year 2015 bill, we need to work together to help the Department of Defense address very serious challenges, from ending major combat operations in Afghanistan to addressing enduring threats from North Korea and Iran, flashpoints in the Middle East, Africa, and Asia. And of course, there are also pressing issues at home, such as the epidemic of sexual assaults, suicides among military members. We need to ensure that the quality of life for those service members staying in the military remains high, while those transitioning out of the services are cared for properly. And I applaud the Department for submitting a 2015 request that stays within the caps permitted in existing law, which already directs more than 50% of all discretionary spending to defense. Barring an agreement to increase investments in both categories, the Department must live within its cap, as you well know. Tough choices must be made, but as the 2014 omnibus showed, our committee is up to the task. In times of fiscal constraint and uncertainty, it's hard to juggle all requirements, but we owe it to our service members and the nation to get it right. And I'd like to just ask a question. I thank the Chairman for your indulgence. As we well know, sexual assault and harassment in the military was front and center during last year's budget cycle. Due to the ongoing investigations and revelations on this heinous crime, the issue still occupies this spot, unbelievably. The President, our Commander-in-Chief, gave the Department a deadline of December 1st, 2014, to evaluate whether changes implemented over the past 12 to 18 months are making a difference. The Pentagon reported about 5,400 instances of sexual assault or unwanted sexual contact in the military in FY 2013, a 60% rise from 2012. Just last week, the top Army prosecutor for sexual assault was suspended after allegations that he sexually harassed a subordinate. Do you believe the military services will be able to stem the rising incidence of sexual assaults or unwanted contact? Is it a cultural problem? Is it a leadership problem? Will opening more military positions to women at all ranks help the problem? So if you could please describe the requirement for the DoD military criminal investigative organizations to investigate 100% of sexual assault cases, what impact will this have on the MCIOs? And are the MCIOs equipped in both funding and manning to meet this requirement? I'd appreciate your response, Secretary Hagel.
Congresswoman, thank you, and I appreciate very much your leadership on this. In the interest of time, and I can provide as much background for the record as you want, but in the interest of time, let's go back to May of last year. At that time, I directed all the services to do a number of things. In the course of that directive and over the next few months, that resulted in 21 directives that I gave our services. Victims' Rights Council, which victims had never, ever had, not only a process, a mechanism, a highway to deal with them and their concerns in every facet of a victim's rights, but that was just but one of the 21 directives. I actually took the initiative, along with our chairman and our chiefs, to suggest to the Congress that we needed to amend the UCMJ. Obviously, fast forward, and what the Senate did here a few days ago, what the House has been working on, is a culmination, not the end, but a culmination at least of that phase of a lot of the requests that DOD has made of Congress to help us. I also instituted new offices. I've asked for, directed a complete review of all the different offices, not just sexual response offices, and those who have responsibility for carrying out the rights of our victims, but military, police, trainers, basic training, instructors, everyone who has any responsibility for education of our troops. And it's partly that, it's partly culture, it's partly some areas where we haven't paid as much attention. Accountability of leadership is always essential to any of these issues, whether it's sexual assault or any ethical issue. So it's been a wide scope of activities that we've undertaken to get at this. We are going to fix it. It needs to be fixed in the institution. We've asked for help from the outside, from the Congress. The President has taken this up, as you have just noted one example. I meet once a week around the table with the chiefs, the vice chiefs, all our senior components of our enterprise, and it's to give me an update for 1 hour, what's been implemented, what are the problems, what are we not doing right, what do we need to do more. I've been doing this for months. Each week I meet for 1 hour. Either the chief of the service is there or the vice chief is there. Their attorneys there. Their sexual prevention assault people are there. So we're coming at this, Congresswoman, on many fronts. We have to. One quick point, and then if the chairman may want to respond to this as well. Your note of 5,000 sexual assaults and more people coming forward. It's too early yet to make an assessment. Is that encouraging news or is it not encouraging news? We think there may be some encouraging news in this, in that victims are feeling more confident that they can come forward without harassment, without all of the things that have happened to many victims in the past, no one paying any attention or people covering it up, whatever the issue is, that they will be protected, that there will be justice done, their rights will be acknowledged, and they will be respected as victims. So I think there may be some good news in this, that we're developing confidence in the systems, that they have enough confidence to come forward. We'll see. Too early to tell. We haven't fixed all the problem yet, but we will fix it.
Mr. Secretary, oh,
Thank you. I just want to reinforce what the Secretary said. The answer to your question, the simple answer is yes, we have to fix this. It's a stain on our profession. And we've got, just met with the chiefs, we've got 12 metrics, if you will, or measures that we're monitoring to determine whether we've got the trend lines moving in the right direction or not. But we have to fix this because it erodes the foundation of our profession. You know, our profession is built on trust. You don't walk out the gate of a forward operating base in Afghanistan unless you trust the man or woman to your left or right. And this crime and this kind of conduct erodes that trust. So it's not just because it's such a horrible thing to happen to a man or woman in any case. It's that it actually erodes the very foundation of the profession, and we're taking that very seriously.
thank you. And Mr. Secretary, I just wanted to make one other point in closing, because one of the greatest honors we have as members of Congress is to appoint beautiful, young, smart, intelligent women to our nation's service academies. And it's been shocking to me that these young men and women also have this issue that is out of control. So I would just suggest to you that you look at that very carefully, because I know that this is high on the agenda of almost all of us who appoint people to our academies, and I thank you very much. Thank you so much for your
Thank you, Ms. Lowy. We should have zero tolerance for this type of behavior. Pleased to yield to the Vice Chair, Ms. Granger.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I have two questions. Should you want me to? I'm sorry. Two questions. Should I wait for another round for the second or? Thank you. Mr. Secretary, as you and I have both discussed before, the Joint Strike Fighter is critical to the U.S. and our allies' ability to maintain air superiority, but both China and Russia continue to dramatically increase their defense spending in an effort to increase their influence throughout the world. With both countries developing stealth fighters, it's likely they will export these planes to other countries. So what countries concern you the most as potential buyers of their aircraft, and how would those potential purchases impact the ability of the U.S. and our allies to establish and maintain air superiority in those regions?
Congresswoman, one of the points I made in my opening statement, in much of the strategy of the QDR and essentially what was behind the President's defense strategy guidance that he issued in January of 2012 was not to allow our superiority, our technological edge, to erode or to forfeit that to any nation. And as I have noted, we've put a premium focus on that, on our prioritization, on the modernization of our capabilities. The Joint Strike Fighter is a good example of that. And that's what we're committed to do. Our budget reflects that. Our strategy reflects that. Everything we're doing reflects that. We've had good partnership on the F-35, as you know, with a number of other countries. And those allies are continuing to hang in there with us. Everyone has budget issues, as you know. And so some of the orders have slowed down, but none, as far as I know, have been canceled.
Right.
So we're always in a competitive race with adversaries who are upgrading and financing that upgrading. But we have to play our game. We have to recognize that threat is going to be out there, and we have to be wise in the decisions we've made. And I think that that we are doing exactly that.
Thank you. I have one other question for the Secretary. In 2011, the Air Force proposed a plan that restructured the Air National Guard. And the Guard opposed this plan, but their attempts to work with the Air Force on an alternative solution were dismissed. Congress didn't appreciate that, nor did they respond very well to that approach. Unfortunately, it appears that the Army is attempting a very similar tactic. So, Mr. Secretary, given the Guard's critical role both domestically and internationally, what are you doing to ensure the Army takes the concerns of the National Guard Bureau and our governors seriously? I can't see Congress supporting a plan that they so vehemently oppose.
Congresswoman, first, I put a high priority on the Guard and the National Guard and the reserves. The President does. I know all of our chiefs do, and General Dempsey may want to address this. That's where I start. As I noted in my opening statement, the Guard and Reserves are going to continue to be, must be, a vibrant part of our larger national security enterprise, and they will. That's where I start. Second, as you know, the Guard has a seat at the table with the Joint Chiefs. General Frank Grass, who's a very, very articulate, capable spokesman for the interests of the Guard. I just met 2 days ago with Governor O'Malley of Maryland. We interface with governors on trying to connect with them. That was part of the reason behind setting up the Governor's Council a few years ago, which the Secretary of Department of Homeland Security and the Secretary of Defense co-chair, to get that input from them directly, from their adjutant generals. Now, to the more specific points of your question, we have in every way tried to protect as much as possible the Guard and Reserve, and I gave you some numbers which I think reflect pretty well how we've come up with decisions to protect them in every way. In fact, the active duty Army proportionally are taking far bigger cuts in every way than what we're talking about for the Guard here. So their voice is important. It is heard. We need it to be heard. But the bottom line is, when we're talking about the cuts that we have already taken and what's ahead, and then on top of that the uncertainty yet that we have to deal with, we have to examine everything, and we have to come at this from what Chairman Dempsey said, and this is exactly the way we looked at the budget, the balance of what is going to be required for the national security interests of this country. I don't see anybody exempt from that because everybody plays an important role, but it has to fit into the overall framework of the balance of what I said, readiness, capability, capacity, and the modernization.
Thank you.
If I could add, Congresswoman, I don't agree actually that the Army has, the active Army has been unwilling or unable to hear the concerns of the Guard, because I've been watching this debate over the past year, and it may just be that they've come to a position where they can't agree with each other, and we've got to work through that. But they've been engaged. Secondly, it is about balance for me. I mean, my responsibility is the joint force, and that's all the services and all the components who together have to be greater than the sum of their parts. And so as we go forward, what I've suggested to active Guard and Reserve is the thing we ought to be most concerned about is not that whether we can agree or not on an end state number or a number of bases or a number of weapons. We've got to link arms on the message that if we go to sequestration levels of cuts, if we go back to that in 2016 and beyond, we won't be able to maintain a balanced force, and in which case we won't have the military that the nation needs.
Thank you, Ms. Granger. Mr. Visclosky.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, just a couple of things. First, I do want to thank you because last year when I asked questions about audible financial statements, you indicated that they would be completed, if you would, by the end of September 30th, 2017. Note that in the statements prepared for the budget, that deadline continues to be the same and has not slid to the right. I do think it's an important principle. I think it's important as far as underlying financing of the department, and I appreciate that that has not slid to the right, and would encourage you to continue to hold fast to that September 30th, 2017 date. I would want to add my voice again to the chairman, as well as to reiterate my opening remarks concerns, and that is on OCO. I'm certain, as we meet here today, that it is not the decision of anyone on the panel not to provide details for $79 billion. Understand there's very delicate negotiations going on. We're anticipating the outcomes of elections, and we need a statement signed. Also realize it's probably very difficult for the administration to come up with one set of numbers, assuming an agreement is signed. A second, if no agreement is signed, and then a third as to what the next 6 months look if there's a complete pullout. But there is a fundamental problem we face when we go to the floor, hopefully earlier rather than later. And I speak only for myself, but I think it's impossible for us to go to the floor with a placeholder for $79 billion. The Comptroller has mentioned other alternatives. In the past, supplemental requests have been used. I'm not going to ask for a response, except as discussions take place with the President and other officials in the administration, they've got to understand there's some urgency here as far as the appropriations process. The question I do want to ask is on readiness. In the budget submittal, the Department stated that with the enactment of fiscal year 2014 appropriations, the readiness levels are trending positive, but the fiscal year began with relatively low readiness levels. Did mention the opportunity growth and security initiative that is very dependent upon entitlement changes and tax changes. Mr. Secretary, I absolutely agree with you on sequestration. I voted against the agreement last December because it was only for 2 years. You have a government to run and a department to plan for. And I am concerned that those who want to, if you would, act irresponsibly are simply lying low until November, and they will continue to have the leverage. And on readiness, the opportunity growth and security initiative that has been put forth, that I do not think is going to happen, includes additional monies for readiness enhancements for training for the Army, spares and logistics support for the Navy, unit training for the Marines, and increased flight training for the Air Force. The question I have is relative to the 15 requests and looking at the issue of readiness to make sure nobody's ever in a fair fight. I agree with that. Are some of those items things we should have in mind as we mark our bill up that are still necessary in 15, assuming that this initiative is not adopted? Are there still readiness holes that we should be concerned about if this initiative is not adopted?
Well, I think, first let me begin the answer this way, and then I'm sure the Comptroller would want to respond to this, and the Chairman may also. I think all of us, certainly Chairman Dempsey and I, have made it clear in our opening statements, and all of the chiefs and the combatant commanders who have been on the Hill this last week and will be up here next week, and some before the Appropriations Committee already this week, have made it very clear that readiness is a concern, will continue to be a concern. Let's take the $26 billion additional piece for FY 2015 that the President has asked for. And Hale can go deep into this, but about 40% of that, I think, is for readiness, is to just try to get us back up out of this hole to some extent that we've sunk into the last 2 years. And so readiness is something that is up front all the time for all of us in all of our planning. If we don't get that additional money, then we've already talked a little bit about the future years, 16 through 19. Mm-hmm. But I think your question is, should you be looking at something for 15 if you don't get the money? Well, I'm going to ask Hale how he handle that in the budget specifically. But yes, it's always a concern for us, and it's going to continue to be a concern. So,
Sir, let me,
go ahead.
if I could, readiness is a very difficult thing to define, to be honest with you. We struggle with it. We keep working at it. But, so let me give you a little historical perspective. This is my third appearance before this committee, and 3 years ago.
Doesn't get better than that, does it?
I know. I look forward to it every year, I promise. It gets easier every year. Not really. But in any case, not because of you, by the way. Just the issues seem to become more and more complex. But some of you will remember that 3 years ago, we highlighted the fact that coming out of 12 years of, or that at that time it was 9 or 10 years, of fighting a particular kind of conflict, that even if we didn't have this challenge called the Budget Control Act, that it would take us a few years to restore our readiness in terms of resetting the force after having, worked it for so hard for so long. And secondly, that there were forms of warfare, kinds of fights for which we hadn't prepared. So, for example, we've become extraordinarily capable at counterinsurgency, counterterror. Less so some of our skills have eroded in things like maneuver warfare, and that's true of every service. So if you're the Army, it's the movement of larger formations over distance, integrating fires, joint fires, and Army fires. For the Air Force, it's suppression of enemy air defenses. We haven't had to do that for a long time. It's forced entry for the naval forces in concert with Army and Air. There are things we just haven't practiced. And 3 years ago, I said, we got to practice those. And then along came the Budget Control Act and took $52 billion a year. Well, first of all came the $487 billion, followed by the Budget Control Act. We have not yet been able to restore our credentials, if you will, to rekindle some of those lost skills. And that problem persists. And it's taking us longer to restore our full readiness than it should.
Mr. Hale, you're going to have to hold for a while because I want to make sure members have a chance. If that's all right, Mr. Fiscal, thank you very much. Mr. Crenshaw.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being back. A special word of thanks to Undersecretary Hale for his service, and just would note that he was a great traveling companion to the North Pole not too long ago. So if you ever go back to the North Pole, please call me. Love to make a return trip. I want to ask a question or two about ships. I've been in Congress for about a decade, but I've been around the Navy all my life because I'm from a community where the Navy has a big presence. And I've seen times when the Navy was modernizing and transforming and changing. I've seen leaner times when the Navy was had ships that couldn't deploy because maintenance had been neglected. But I never have seen a time when we didn't need the Navy. Its flexibility, its firepower, its presence. There's never been a time we didn't have that need. And I guess when I look at the number of ships, it makes me think about how important the ships are. And then for the last year, we've had briefings about how we need to pivot to the Pacific, that's the geographic area that we've got to be concerned about in terms of our national security. And I guess to be successful there, we'd need a strong maritime presence. And so that seems to indicate probably more ships as well. And I know that there was a time when Ronald Reagan said we ought to have 600 ships and 15 aircraft carriers. And times have changed. The ships today are a lot more capable, a lot more technologically advanced. But I don't think we ought to kid ourselves. I think numbers still matter. And we still haven't figured out the age-old problem of how you have one ship in two different places at the same time. And the world hadn't gotten any safer. I know the world hadn't gotten any smaller. And so when I look at the budget, Mr. Secretary, in my opinion, the numbers just don't add up. On one hand, you have the Secretary of the Navy saying that we're going to grow our fleet size from about 285 to a little over 300. And that makes sense, but that's contradicted by the fact that the Navy's going to require 20 less littoral combat ships than they planned. You mentioned 11 cruisers are going to be laid up. I don't know exactly what that means. There's talk that maybe a carrier that still has 25 years of useful life that might be decommissioned. So it seems to me that you got to figure out how we're doing all this counting, because if you're taking 11 cruisers that don't have weapon systems and don't have crews, I don't know if they're counted in part of our fleet. I don't know if you count an aircraft carrier that might or might not be decommissioned. So ordinarily I'd ask the Secretary of Navy this question, but Mr. Secretary, my understanding is a lot of the decisions that are being made are coming from your office, which is appropriate. In other words, which ships we're going to keep, which ships we're not going to keep, how much money we're going to spend to develop the Navy that we need today. And so I do think it's appropriate to ask you if you could tell this subcommittee how you plan to meet those requirements. And I'd like to ask General Dempsey if he's looked at those plans, and if does that, you've kind of validated the size and the makeup of this planned fleet, because as I understand it, the combatant commanders, when they request assistance from the Navy, they are accommodated about less than half the time. So I've seen the number 43% of the requests that are made by the combatant commanders actually have the requirements met. So it seems to me if you face greater risks and you have less ships, then there'll be even less a percentage of those requirements be met. So if you all could comment on those two, I would very much appreciate it.
Congressman, first, yes, we're going to need a Navy. I don't think there's any question about that. The Navy is a critically important component for forward presence and power projections and all the things that you know. So make no mistake, no one is suggesting otherwise. That's first. Second, of the specific examples you used, all of those examples you used except one, the LCS, and I want to come back to that, those were recommendations made to me by the Navy. So those were not initiated out of my office. Those came from the Navy. And I accepted them, and I'm going to address LCS. But I think the bigger point here is if you've only got so much money to go around, you've only got so much money to go around. And I can't invent more money. And so I've got to balance a budget. I've got to balance our force structure, because I don't think there's any question that we're still going to need an Army and an Air Force and modernization. Half of our money goes to compensation, retirement, benefits, so I don't think there's any question there. We want to make sure our people are taken care of. So I've only got so much. I'd like to have more ships. I'd like to have more planes. Everybody'd like to have more of everything. On the LCS, you made the comment that we're taking 20 of the LCSs out. That's not exactly right. The program of record for the LCS was 52. The decision I made was play that out to 32. There's a specific mission for the LCS. But what I asked the Navy to do, directed the Navy to do, and they accepted this, is to come back to me by the end of the year and tell me, give me some options for a more capable LCS, one that's far more survivable than this one. Upgun. This panel has already talked about, and we'll hear more about, as this focus should be, the technological capabilities of our adversaries. You can have a lot of ships, Congressman, but if they don't have the capability to survive and the power that they need, and the projection of that power is yeah, that's out there, but if they can't survive these new technologies, then I'm not sure we've made the right decision. It isn't a matter of we're going to lose 20 ships. What I said to the Navy is come back to me, see if there's a better way to do this. All that money is not that was budgeted for the LCS is not taken out of their program. So if that helps clear that up, that was the reasoning behind this. So in the interest of time, I'll be glad to go further on any of this.
The time is of the essence. I know you want to weigh in, General, but I do want to get to other members. Thank you, Mr. Crenshaw. Mr. Moran, thank you for your patience.
Well, sure. Let me start with the positive. This is a good and responsible budget, particularly under the circumstances. And General Dempsey, you're proving to yourself to be an excellent chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and thank you for your service. And Mr. Hale, you are a true professional, a real gentleman and extraordinarily good guy. You've been a delight to work with. And Mr. Secretary, I mean it when I say that you are a man of exceptional character and courage and ability, and really the finest person we could find at this time in the history of the Defense Department. So I want to thank you as well. The three of you are the best bet then for tackling what I think may be our most serious threat to a robust defense budget. And that may not be any military threat outside our borders. Just as entitlement programs are squeezing our ability to invest in the kinds of programs that would ensure a stronger economic and social future for our country, the cost of military pay and health care is now a third of the Department's budget, and it's the fastest growing element. And unless we get some handle on it, it really is going to foreclose many of the discretionary options that are necessary within our defense budget. And to a greater extent, it really isn't an investment in the future of our security. I was very disappointed in what has happened to the effort to trim by 1% military retirement pay. 87% of our military veterans don't get retirement. They don't stay for 20 years. A lot of them are the kids who get the most serious combat wounds. But there are many who will stay for 20 years and then, more often than not, because they're particularly healthy, they'll sign up for a second career with a defense contractor. Of course, the contractor doesn't have to pay for their health insurance. It's a good deal all around. And in fact, we find now that by the time they're in their 60s, those who do benefit from retirement pay and another salary in the top 5% of compensation throughout the country. I don't, that doesn't bother me. In fact, I think it's a good thing. Living the good life, voting Republican, it's fine. But I'm not sure we can continue to afford it. And I was particularly disappointed that those organizations that represent military retirees were so adamant. I think they knew they were going to ultimately be successful. One of the most, I think, comical arguments was that it's going to affect adversely recruitment. I'm not sure how many 18-year-olds, when told that 20 years later their retirement COLA is going to be cut by 1%, really change their mind about signing up. Can you picture it? Oh no, a 1% cut in my COLA when I'm 38. Oh, let me change my mind on that. They don't. It's the fact that we froze civilian pay. Many of these civilians work alongside those in uniform for 3 years. It just shows you that it's an area that we're going to have to overcome politically, but somehow you're going to have to get a handle on in the budget. And what you've suggested is kind of trimming around the edges. Now, this is not supposed to be a speech, it's supposed to be a question, so I'm going to ask you if you think there's any chance that the Commission on Military Compensation can give us an opportunity to get a handle on the fastest rising portion of the defense budget, because it really seems unsustainable. Mr. Secretary.
Well, that is the charge of the commission that the Congress set up, and we have just sent a number of options to them, as you probably know, on retirement. And for all the reasons you mentioned, I think it's been pretty clear across our leadership spectrum that we can't continue to sustain the kind of commitments that we are now obligated to sustain. And just one point on the COLA -1 issue, as you know, that would be for, I think you referenced people coming in after January 1st of this year. But no, this is a serious issue. It has to be dealt with. I'm hopeful that the Commission will come forward with some very smart recommendations. The Congress is going to have to work with all of us on this. We can't move without the Congress on this, as you know. And I would tell you that I'm committed, our enterprise is committed to work with you on what those recommendations will be. But it is a key part of our future enterprise in order to deal with this. And it's the most difficult part, as you have.
Yeah. Well, I know we're the problem more than you, but yes.
I'll be very brief, Chairman. What we're trying to do here is slow the growth. So we're trying to slow growth. We want the money to go back to the services so they can do things like plow it back into readiness and maintenance and equipment. And we want to do it once. By the way, that's important. You know, I know that you pass annual budgets, but we want to have paid compensation health care reform once so that the force can settle and stabilize against a new set of compensation standards. And on retirement, Congressman, the one place I probably part company with you a bit is I have said and will continue to advise or recommend that any changes to retirement should be grandfathered for the force currently serving.
Sure.
Thank you, Mr. Moran, for raising an important issue. Mr. Calvert.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, gentlemen, for coming to speak to us today. I'd like to talk a little bit about the DoD civilian workforce. It was mentioned briefly, Mr. Secretary, in your statement. The committee has heard official and unofficial testimony in the past that the effect of the DoD could use some assistance from Congress in better managing its workforce, giving you some legal authorities. According to the American Enterprise Institute, over the last 10 years, the active duty military grew by 3.4%, while the number of civilian defense employees grew by 17.4%. Despite this disparity, and in light of our fiscal challenges, I'm concerned that your testimony does not address in any real detailed effort to rebalance the Defense Department's workforce. Rather, your proposed defense cut would obviously shrink the Army and obviously would add to risk in certain areas. I'm introducing some legislation tomorrow, which I've worked with some former comptrollers. We discussed this in Los Angeles at the Defense Forum, which would require DoD to make necessary reductions to its civilian workforce in a systematic manner without compromising our ability to maintain a strong national defense over the long term. I think it's time that we obviously keep the best and brightest of our civilian workforce and bring the workers into balance with the active duty force. So my question, Secretary, in your testimony, you mentioned a 5-year defense plan which includes savings from reducing civilian personnel and contractor costs, but I didn't see any real details on how you would do that. Just one last comment. Last year, former Secretary Lehman wrote in a Wall Street Journal article that each 7,000 civilian employee reduction saves at least $5 billion over 5 years. Can you explain in more detail how your proposal to reduce civilian personnel and contractors will be implemented and savings that will result?
Congressman, first, and I'll ask the Comptroller to give you some numbers on this. We did focus, and those numbers and how we would intend to do it are in the budget and the specifics of that. We did focus exactly on what you just talked about. We have been focusing on the civilian workforce, trying to judiciously explore what their role is. 20% of the headquarters staff over the next 5 years, of all headquarters staffs, will be cut. Chairman Dempsey and I did this together, the Joint Chiefs at all headquarters across the globe. Now, when you look at just plain numbers, that doesn't represent a great number, but it's not insignificant. But it's bigger than that, and the percentages here are pretty impressive. What we're looking at, and if I can ask the Comptroller to explain what's in that budget, the specifics of how we intend to do it, and the focus that we put on it. But we did focus on it.
I'll keep it short and we can give you more detail. There's about a 5% cut in civilian full-time equivalents between fiscal 14 and fiscal 19 in this budget, similar to the reduction in the active strength. It comes from reorganizations. It comes from recognizing that workload is going down as, for example, the war ends. And it comes, and here we could use your help, from BRAC. And when you get rid of a brigade combat team, you don't get rid of many civilians. If you close the base, that team where it was, then you save all the infrastructure, and that's a lot of civilians. So if you give us BRAC authority, we'll be much better able to...
Well, let me follow up on that. As you know, we've been through several BRACs, and we've been through several previous secretaries, and they've all tried to reform and reduce DOD civilian workforce, most notably Secretary Rumsfeld. But they failed to do so. And now I've been told by some of your predecessors and some of your former comptrollers that you're unable to do so because of laws that are on the books, the number and so forth, that especially on issues regarding performance, to make significant reductions in the civilian workforce. The Defense Business Board, you mentioned 5%. The Defense Business Board said that it is necessary to bring back into a ratio relative to civilian to military employees. It should be a reduction of 15% over 5 years. Would you agree with that number?
We set our civilian numbers to match workload, so I mean, these are service recommendations that seemed right to us, so I wouldn't be willing to sign up to a 15% cut, especially if we can't get rid of if we're going to have to keep civilians at bases we don't need.
Mr. Calvert, thank you for your questions. Ms. McCollum, thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning. I guess I could almost say good afternoon, gentlemen. Mr. Secretary, this defense budget makes tough choices that are responsible and necessary, and it has my support. Yet this year's tough choices are modest when you compare them to the dangerous budget choices that we'll face next year if sequestration remains in place, as you gentlemen have pointed out. So I believe it's high time that some of my conservative colleagues in Congress stop criticizing this budget, instead find the political courage to put new revenue on the table to fund our national security priorities. But absent this political courage or new revenue, we are not going to make America stronger and more secure by cutting domestic priorities like education, infrastructure investments, health research, or Social Security to fund the Pentagon's budget. So to follow up on what you started talking about, BRAC, you know, one of the tough choices in this budget is a new round of closings. In 2004, the Department estimated that it had about 25% excess infrastructure. So, Mr. Hale, you started to kind of allude to this. Could you give us the estimate of excess Defense Department infrastructure today?
Well, I have to give you the same number. We have not been allowed to plan, and so we haven't. But we know that it was about 25% at the end of the BRAC 2005 round, and it is almost certainly higher now because we have reduced forces. So there's a good deal of unneeded infrastructure out there.
Okay. So, Secretary Hagel, is it fair to say that as Congress continues to spend billions of dollars every year for military facilities and infrastructure that the Department of Defense does not need or no longer wants, that it impacts projected savings in future year defense programs from implementing the, you know, when we don't close BRAC, that means there's less money for readiness, there's less money for modernization and other priorities. Could you maybe explain how, if we don't do that, you can't do some of the things that General Dempsey and you were talking about for preparing our force to be well-rounded?
Congresswoman, it's really pretty simple. If you're paying for overhead you don't need, whether it's people that Congressman Calvert talked about, or all the expense that goes with overhead you don't need, then you are absorbing resources from the more viable parts of your enterprise, and that's just less money you have. And so I don't think it's anything more complicated than that. It's complicated to get there. It's imperfect, I know that. But the longer we defer this, and the longer we continue to keep that excess capacity that we're paying for, taking money away from the real important aspects of our mission and our national security, the higher price we're going to pay for that. And at some point, then, at some future Congress or whoever's running the Pentagon at the time and the next chairman, they're going to have to make some tough choices. And that's what I said in my opening statement. The chairman has noted it. You all know it. That's life. So we're far wiser to get at this now to try to sort this out. But make no mistake, it is costing us now.
Thank you. As the White House and the Pentagon has to consider a withdrawal of a U.S. troop zero option, and it was alluded to with the dollar figure that the ranking member brought up with on the floor, there's also something else I would like you to briefly touch on. What is your assessment of Afghan security forces' capacity to sustain the gains our troops have made and ensure that progress made by civil society and women in Afghanistan will allow to be continued to develop?
I don't think there would be anybody here certainly today that would argue that things are not better in Afghanistan for women, for the people of Afghanistan than they were 10 years ago. That's come at a cost, yes. And the real question, I think, and General Dunford addressed this yesterday, and General Dunford will continue to address it, Chairman Dempsey noted in his opening statement, that how do we protect that as much as we can, as best we can, the tremendous gains that have been made, the sacrifices that we've made, our people, to help the Afghan people get there. Obviously, they are a sovereign nation. They have the responsibility to defend themselves, just as Iraq does. We have tried to help build those capacities as we have dealt with the terrorism issue, which led us there in the first place. But the open question is if, in fact, there is no role for the United States, and if there is no role for our allies, and let's not forget, we have 50 International Security Force allies with us in Afghanistan and NATO, then there is an open question on the vulnerabilities that they're going to be dealing with. I have confidence in the tremendous progress the Afghan Army has made, their institutions. It's imperfect, I know. Our Inspector Generals remind us of that every day. But they've made great progress, and General Dempsey was just there, as he noted. He made some evaluations, and he stays very close to this every day. I talk to Dunford on a regular weekly civets, in touch with him, our commanders as well, a number of times each week. But there is risk, and there is unpredictability.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you, Ms.
Mr. Chair.
McCollum. Mr. Cole.
Thank you very much. Gentlemen, first, thank all of you for your service, and I appreciate it more than I can say. We may occasionally have some disagreements, but nobody on this panel doubts anybody's commitment to the defense of the country or absolute personal integrity, and appreciates all the service. So I want to focus on two or three things quickly, but I first want to make a quick remark. This is a budget full of really tough choices. I don't think there's any doubt about it. You made some choices you didn't want to have to make. And I want to associate myself, Mr. Secretary, with a couple of your remarks, because I think you made those tough choices because we in Congress and the administration have not made the tough choices that we ought to make. Frankly, we all know we're under a cloud here of fiscal restraint that is beyond what anybody on this panel wants to see happen where the military is concerned. So, again, your job would get a lot easier if we did our job as well as you do your job. And hopefully the next couple of years we'll be able to find some way to get there. most of the members on this panel, I look at, have voted for every deal that's been out there, whether it's the fiscal cliff or whether it was, reopen the government or the Ryan Murray deal, and they did that in large measure because they are very concerned about the men and women in uniform and about the challenges that we've dealt you as leaders. So, again, I think the real message here at a deeper level, beyond the budget, is the political class of the country needs to start doing its job so that you guys are free to do yours. Now, the two areas of concern that I had quickly to focus on, one, you made some tough choices in this budget concerning our AWAC fleet, and that's a pretty low density but high use asset that we're using right now. As you mentioned, in full disclosure, it's a parochial concern. Most of those are stationed in my district at Tinker Air Force Base, so obviously I've got a concern there. But I think the fact that you could immediately deploy 6 of them, and you've got missions in the books for Homeland Security, to deny and to defeat. I mean, it's an asset we use an awful lot. So I'd like to get your thinking on why we can lose that percentage. I recognize there have to be cuts, not just in one place. This is a very high percentage of this asset, essentially 25% that we're going to be losing. Second question, and somewhat related, I just would like you, if we have enough time, to expound a little bit. This sort of picks up on Mr. Calvert's question about, are you comfortable with where you're at in terms of the depot system that we have? I mean, do you have what you need for modernization? Do you have what you need in terms of personnel? When you look at civilian reductions, where do you see those coming across the civilian workforce? I think we get high value out of our depots, and just want to kind of probe your thinking a little bit on where these civilian personnel cuts could come from, what areas of economizing there are out there.
Thank you, Congressman, and thank you for your comments. Starting with your last question, using depots as an example, but it's a broader question, picking up on Congressman Calvert's question, which is a very important one. I think I would refer back to what the Comptroller noted in any business person, many of you are business people, or any responsible person who has responsibilities for an institution and people and so on, knows that you've got to match your resources up with your mission. You match your people with the mission. And what the Comptroller was noting in general answer, I think, to Congressman Calvert, was we have tried to focus on what the civilian component responsibilities are for this institution. Everyone knows they support the military. And so what is their exact role? How many do we need? How many not need as the world changes, everything shifts? So we've tried to do that. I know we're not perfect at it, but we prioritize that. So that'd be the first general answer I'd make to your point. Depots and the civilian workforce there are really critically important for all the reasons of starting with the mission of the depot and how do they support the military. And so we focus on, again, those missions, and those missions that are most critical to support of our military and national security interests. That's always the starting point. On AWACS and some of the tough choices we made, I followed most all of the recommendations that our chiefs and our secretaries made. General Dempsey deserves tremendous credit in working through this. This was not an easy process internally, as you all can imagine. Each service chief, of course, has the responsibility for his or her service. And we have to rely, the President has to rely, I have to rely, on the fact that they will be an adequate and efficient, effective spokesman for their service. They will protect that service. That's their job. But in the end, they also have a bigger responsibility, and that's the entire enterprise. And the chiefs had to make some very tough recommendations based on these fiscal restraints. And so I think they did a very effective job, much because General Dempsey helped them work through all this. It wasn't easy for anybody. And so therefore, your direct question to me, those were recommendations in almost every case that came from the service chiefs, the secretaries, on what they thought they were going to need with the restraints, fiscal restraints, to protect the country, do the job that they're asked to do.
I'm sure this was taken into consideration, just last point, and I don't need a follow-up answer, but this is an asset that does enhance the capability of our allies. It's not just an asset for our own, and so in that sense, it's a force multiplier. It is, I think, one of these things can be enormously useful. That's really how we're using it now, as I understand it, in Romania and Poland. So it's something that's a capability that not very many other people have that we do, obviously. So.
You know, there are strong arguments, Congressman, on both sides of that. Those are close calls. I mean, I get it. Yeah.
Mr. Cole?
I'm sorry we put you in that position.
No.
I'm sorry,
Mr.
Mr.
Cole,
Chairman. Yield back.
points well taken. Mr. Ryan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen. I'm going to cover a little bit of territory first, Mr. Secretary. I'd like to thank you. Last time you were here, I talked with you about an airman, Carl Herrig, who was murdered in my district, and his wife fled back to Brazil, and I want to thank you for your help. And I may have a question or two for the record on that issue. With the issue of Ukraine, one of the issues, if you look at the map of Ukraine, you obviously see a lot of gas pipelines coming in and out of Russia. One of the things we're trying to do here is export more of this newly accessed natural gas that we have in the United States in eastern Ohio and western Pennsylvania. Can you just talk for a minute or two, General and Mr. Secretary, about what you think the Pentagon Department of Defense position is on using our bounty that we have here as an opportunity to wean a lot of the European countries off of Russian natural gas?
Congressman, thank you for your comments regarding your former constituent, too. Well, first, that's not our area of responsibility specifically, as you know, as you implied. Not that we are unmindful and cannot be of all the different tools that the President has to conduct foreign policy to assure our national security and our national interests around the world. And certainly your question brings into focus one of those areas. I know that the interagency is looking at all these different options. I do know that I'm no expert on any of this, but I do know that one of the issues that we are dealing with, we, not DOD, but just our economy domestically on as far as exports on liquefied natural gas, is our terminals. We don't really have the facilities that I know some are being built and plan to be built. Mm-hmm. But your bigger question, though, is one that we really don't get involved in. I don't know, the Chairman may have a response to it.
Just to align myself with your thinking that an energy independent and net exporter of energy as a nation has the potential to change the security environment around the world, notably in Europe and in the Middle East. And so as we look at our strategies for the future, I think we've got to pay more and particular attention to energy as an instrument of national power. And because it will very soon, in the next few years, potentially become one of our more prominent tools.
Yeah, I appreciate that. We had a meeting with Ms. Merkel a year ago today. The German study group was in Germany, and the first question she asked us was about how do we get some natural gas. And now the world is seeing how they're in the middle of this whole play that's happening. The other issue and final question is regarding the defense industrial base. And I know you said earlier that the defense industrial base is an important national asset, which those of us in the industrial Midwest certainly know. One of the issues is as we move to cut some of these programs and weapon systems, I think it's important for us to understand how that's going to affect the industrial base, how that's going to affect the supply chains, Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3, all the way down, subcontractors, all the way through the supply chain. And I don't think that DOD has yet a full, deep understanding of the supply chain. And I want to know and ask, is there any move afoot or initiative within the Department of Defense to really map and figure out what this supply chain looks like? And it would certainly have benefits into other manufacturing sectors as well.
Congressman, your point here is very, very important, and I alluded to it, as you noted in my statement. But to your question, yes, we do, matter of fact, pay a lot of attention to this. I don't know if our Undersecretary for Acquisitions has been up here, Frank Kendall, to talk with any of you. I suspect most of you know who he is. He comes from the business world. He comes, in fact, he's a West Point graduate. But he has spent a lot of time on this, as all of our chiefs have, our services have, because everyone recognizes that industrial base is where that strength, where that comes from. Every decision we make, recommendation we make, factors that in, Congressman. Now, you may disagree with some of the decisions, but it goes back to what we've been talking about all morning. I mean, when we're limited with resources, we've got to make some hard choices. I'd like to keep all the airplanes flying and all the ships steaming and more ships, more airplanes, but I don't have that opportunity to do that. So we have to make tough choices, but I want to assure you, and we'll be glad to come over and give you a complete briefing on this too as to how we do this, that your point is a very important part of all our decision making.
Chairman, could I just add
yes, very briefly? Thank you.
To your point, I'm sure there are things happening out there that we haven't yet been able to fully understand. So, for example, the big providers are able to absorb the uncertainty that that we're all confronted with. The smaller ones, subcontractors, are not. And so I'm sure that in terms of the big providers, the effect is probably pretty minimal. But I think among the small providers, it's probably pretty significant. And it argues for the kind of certainty we've been asking. Long-term certainty will mitigate the risk that we lose some of these really important and smaller providers.
Thank you, General. Thank you, Mr. Ryan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Womack, thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And again, I'd like to add my thanks to the panel here today for their great service to our country. And I can't imagine the difficulty you're having in making these tough choices. At the risk of getting down in the weeds, maybe more appropriately at the hover level, I want to talk to you about ask you for your explanation on the decision on attack aviation out of the Guard into the active component in totality. And then there's a second piece to this question that is more strategic thinking in nature. Does it signal that there is a new construct to how we look at our Guard and Reserve, who for many, many years since the war on terror began has become more of an operational force, and now we are making a proposal or making a decision to take strategic depth away from attack aviation and put it in the active component? Does that signal a change in the construct of how we look at our Guard and Reserve?
Thank you, Congressman. That's a critically important question, and I'm going to ask the General to address it, because he's probably, not probably, I can't speak for the all-knowing Comptroller here who's expert on everything, or at least we go to him for everything. But there's certainly nobody at this table, nobody in this room I'm aware of who knows more about this question than the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So I'm going to defer. I've got an answer, but his will be better. So let me defer my answer and let General Dempsey address this.
Please, General. Thank you.
I can't promise you better, but I will promise you as much information as I can possibly provide. And I'd be happy to also take a further follow-on for the record. The Army is essentially trying to reduce the number of platforms from 7 to 4, to replace some aging platforms that, frankly, are just cost inefficient. And in so doing, turn the Apache helicopter both from an attack platform into a scout helicopter, link it with some unmanned aerial systems in order to form a scout weapons team. To do that, their intent, as currently briefed, is to move the attack helicopter fleet, as you note, into the active component, but replace the the loss of aircraft in the Guard with lift helicopters, which have both utility in a combat environment, but also in homeland defense, humanitarian assistance, disaster relief. I can assure you it is not a move toward pushing the Guard back into a strategic reserve. That's actually a separate issue. I can understand the question, and I can understand the concern on the part of the Guard, but the Guard will always remain part of our operational capability, albeit the attack helicopter capability, the rotary wing attack helicopter capability would be removed. We're now in negotiation, frankly, and in discussion with the Guard about how much of it can be operational at any given time in balance with the active component, and how much of it then would be in a more strategic role. And that's a discussion that will persist for the foreseeable future as we determine what our needs will be. But we're not trying to push the Guard onto the shelf, I assure you.
My last comment would be this, and if you want to respond to it, fine. You've already touched on this notion that we're pretty good right now at counterinsurgency. We've been doing that for a long time. We're really good at it. Some of the more recent activities going on in Eastern Europe concern me that we could be thrust back into some kind of full-spectrum operational environment, and we're not very good at that now. We're not certified, as you called it. You're credentialed to do that. We have to know up here, as we pivot to new threats, emerging threats, we have to know up here where we are weak in our ability to respond, to project power into these trouble spots, and the sooner the better. So I got it. I agree with you. I'm concerned about it, and I hope that our nation can become as concerned about it.
Thank you, Mr. Womack, for some excellent on-point questions. Mr. Owens.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, thank you for being here. I want to go to an issue that's been raised several times, but you've clearly, I think, laid out an argument that we have excess weapon systems, or at least aging weapon systems. We have facilities that are, in your minds, at least not necessary, and obviously that brings people along in the process as well. You've also told us that we've not allowed you to plan to deal with that issue. If you had the capacity to plan, how long would it take you to construct that something that would tell us where you anticipated being after you made cuts, and then how would that lay over to what you see as the mission and or threats that you're trying to address? Because it's clear to me that we've had a change in what we see as our threat assessments over the last 10 or 15 years.
Congressman, were you speaking about, you started your comments about excess capacity, and I'm not sure.
You mean I wasn't clear?
No, I wouldn't put you in my category, but I would. Let me take a run at what I think I can provide you here.
Yeah, maybe I can clarify this. There's been a lot of talk about BRACs.
Yeah, is that?
You've said you can't plan for a BRAC because you don't have authority to plan. What I'm trying to understand is, if we gave you authority to plan, how quickly could you develop a plan, present it to us, and how does that match up with our threat assessments?
On BRAC, you mean?
Right.
Yeah. Well, we've done a lot of planning on that. We know, based on, to your point, corresponding threats, where those threats are. For example, I laid out in my opening statement just a brief 4 specific priorities on our defense strategy guidance. QDR. What was the focus? Homeland Security, went right down through that. Then let's just take those 4 priorities that the President laid out 2 years ago, QDR. Then how do you implement the plans, the programs, the missions, in order to develop, sustain, and then implement those strategies to deal with the threats? And so, yes, we've got a pretty good sense of overhead and structures and so on that we could do without, that don't in fact factor in to the strategic threats that you noted have changed significantly in the last 10, 15 years?
It doesn't appear to me that the public understands that you've had this change in threat assessment and what those threats are and how you would meet those threats. I don't think that's well understood by the public.
Well, maybe not. I suppose, I mean, if you start with the President's strategic, defense strategic guidance and then QDRs, I suspect most in the public don't spend that much time going that deep down into it. And maybe we haven't articulated clearly enough what we see as threats, but I think, in speeches I give, the chairman gives, our chiefs give, we talk about those all the time: cyber, terrorism, so on. And so maybe we could crisp that up better. But I don't think, I mean, when I go out and speak or when I take questions, and when I'm on different forums, different settings, not just up here, but as the chairman does often, we're often asked that. I mean, by the media, by others in various ways. But I don't think it's been any particular secret as to where we thought we needed to go and what the threats were.
You want me to take a swing?
General Dempsey.
Let me take a really brief swing. This is the elevator speech of national security strategy. Our threats can be described as 2, 2, 2, and 1. 2 heavyweights, Russia and China. 2 middleweights, Korea and Iran. 2 networks, Al-Qaeda and the transnational criminal network that runs from south to north in this hemisphere. And 1 domain, cyber. And in response to that, we have distributed the force. We have a very good idea of how much of it should be forward deployed, how much should be rotational, and how much should be in, we call it surge capability in the homeland. We've got that. We can certainly provide that.
Thank you.
Let me just comment before I go to Mr. Adderholt. A lot of emphasis is placed on all these assessments and QDR, and of course, it didn't escape you that in the most recent one of 64 pages, Russia was only mentioned once. I think you perhaps saw that. I mean, that's pretty alarming. Mr. Adderholt.
Thank you. I join my colleagues in welcoming you to our subcommittee, and it's great to have you here this morning. Concerning the Ukrainian situation, touch base about it in just a minute. My question would be, do you feel like, and I'll address this first to the Secretary and then to the Chairman of whoever would like to respond to it, but does it demonstrate it's time for us to move ahead promptly more with a joint Air Force, NASA funding to develop additional capabilities for making powerful rocket engines here in the U.S.? Just your thoughts on that.
You're obviously referring to the relationship we have with the Russians on the rocket motors. Well, I think this is going to engage us in a review of that issue. I don't think there's any question about that.
But do you feel that this is something that is rising to the forefront now with this Ukrainian situation?
Yes, as I just said, I think there's no question it's going to. Sure.
And
well, as you know, we've got relationships not only in the issue of commerce and trade with Russia, but the Northern Distribution Network coming out of Afghanistan, cooperation on counterterror and counter-piracy, many different areas where we have a relationship with them. And I think they will all be under some scrutiny depending on how the issue in the Ukraine evolves.
Let me move over quickly to the LCS. I know it's already been mentioned here this morning, but you know, of course, some concerns about, I think about it, every ship in the fleet will be equally armored. But be that as it may, I believe that the threats which the current LCS are designed to address need to be defended against probably in any way as we go forward the budget process. But in the FY15 budget report, the Navy, understand, acquires 3 LCS ships instead of 4 as originally planned. given the situation, how do you decide which of the two versions of the LCS to put on hold for a year?
Well, first of all, we're not putting anything on hold with the production line that's in place. What I've said is that 32 LCSs, 24 have already been contracted for, and another 8 will need to be contracted for. Those go forward. Those are ongoing now. We budget for them. So there's no change. Those will go right into in the current production line 2020. So that doesn't change. What I've asked the Navy to do is to come back to me, as you may know, you may have seen the memo, and address the issue of if we are projecting out a 300-ship Navy, is it the smartest place we can have a sixth of our ships, LCSs? That's what we're projecting. In the light of some of the points that have been made here today, the new emerging technologies and threats that our adversaries have, is this really what we need and what we want we should be spending our money on? You're correct that the LCS was designed for specific missions, and that isn't changing. We're going ahead with those, for those missions. But then we're talking about, well, is that what we need another 20? Which then, that would represent a sixth of our Navy. So that's the question. Your point about the two holes, one, as you know, being produced in Alabama and the other in Wisconsin, what I've asked the Navy to go do is look at those two holes. Is there any variations that can come with already it's in the production line, research, technology, everything we know about, so you don't start over. How do you come back to me, will you come back to me, with some thoughts about a more survivable ship, a more upgun ship, a more capable ship than what the LCS is presently? So that's the decision. Then we will make a decision in the next budget on that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. And the cost.
I'm sorry?
The cost of that.
The cost.
The cost. That's one of our primary focus.
Yes.
Of what might succeed.
That's right.
Represent an upgrade.
That's right.
Yes, Ms. Capter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and again, thank this panel. We really appreciate your service to our country and your being here today. You're under a lot of pressure on many levels, and we thank you for your great intelligence and your composure. I'm going to ask for 3 items for the record, so I'll just tick these off very quickly and then ask my question. For the record, I would appreciate any information the Department has on Ukraine's military losses, including wounded, in their engagements in support of our efforts in the global war on terrorism. Number 2, in terms of the defense industrial base, a summary of vulnerabilities, of componentry, processes, and trained employees in the sectors you deem most critical. Number 3, there was nothing really in the testimony today dealing with energy security. There was some reference in a question, but in the quadrennial defense review, there was a little bit in there, but I'm very interested in how you, across departments, deal with the management structure to lead the department towards energy security and independence, and in so doing, lead our country in that direction. In terms of questions, in following Mr. Womack's question, he's left the room at this point, but in evaluating your spending reductions across various categories and cost savings associated with these hard choices, I was surprised that the Garden Reserve was also reduced. And in the region that I represent, I'll give you a real specific example of what appears to have happened. I support the Garden Reserve very heavily. They've just performed superbly, and they cost less. But yet at our F-16 unit in northern Ohio, for the first time, someone from active duty has come to command the base. This may be something strategically important that is beyond my ability to comprehend, but never before have we had someone come from active duty into a guard situation at a base that is so highly ranked. And I thought, does that cost more than someone rising within the Guard? Maybe it's an anomaly. Maybe it's something that's unusual with the blending of force. But if that's happening across the country, it's going to cost us more money, I think. So I just point that out with all these changes happening at the Department of Defense. I just think, following with what Mr. Womack said, we need to really look at that and make sure that Guard and Reserve are properly respected on many levels, and because you are really dealing with tough budget choices. Finally, I wanted to reference the area of human effectiveness, brain research that DARPA is doing. So important. We didn't talk much about DARPA today, but I want to pinpoint mental health and of our troops, and particularly alcohol abuse. The most current reports suggest alcohol use disorders, such as alcohol abuse and alcohol dependence, to be 3 times more prevalent in the military than PTSD. How is the military managing what appears to be an epidemic of alcohol misuse, abuse, and dependence, and the co-occurrence of alcohol misuse in a soldier who has either depression or PTSD is recognized as being a common route by which impaired soldiers downwardly drift, leading to attempted suicides. Essentially, alcohol abuse converts a soldier who is depressed and thinking suicide to one who plans and attempts suicide. So this issue of alcohol abuse across the force, including in our veteran population once they're discharged, is very serious. I would just like a comment on that today, and then if you want to provide additional for the record, terrific.
Let me sir, if you want to take the alcohol abuse one on, I mean, clearly we're focused on all manner of social challenges we have with the force. But let me just really briefly on the Guard. The Air Force has actually been the most innovative force of all in integrating their active component in Guard. I went and visited a B-2 squadron, and when they lined up the crew of the B-2 in front of it and introduced me, about every third member was a member of the Guard. So they're looking at ways to integrate the force, and I would like to believe, but we'll check, that what you see manifest in the question you've asked is part of that integration, and that somewhere else there's a National Guardsman taking command of an organization that heretofore has always been active. But I'll check with the only other thing I'd say, and we'll take it for the record to give you the analytics, that cost issue is really a challenging one. The fact is, if you want a Guardsman to be as ready tonight as an active component soldier, sailor, airman, or Marine, it's going to cost you the same thing. You buy readiness. How quickly can you have that man or woman deploy? And that costs exactly the same. So we'll give you the data to document that.
Ms. Capter.
Thank you, and I wanted again to acknowledge Mr. Hale's exemplary service to our country. We wish you Godspeed in the months and years ahead, and thank you so very much.
Thank you, Ms. Capter. Anchoring our questioning is Judge Carter from Texas, who I believe has some of the strongest military presence of any member of Congress in his congressional district. Judge Carter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We like to hope so anyway. And welcome and thank you for being here. I apologize for being bouncing in and out, but I'm chairing a hearing across the hall, and I have to get over there every once in a while and make sure it's moving along. Start off with a more provincial question. FY 2014 Defense Authorization required 2 reviews and reports regarding the issuance of the Purple Heart. The reports are due not later than 100 days from 80 days from passage, which means this May. One review is of the attacks at Fort Hood, Texas, and Little Rock, Arkansas, and requires anyone determined to be eligible for that review to receive the Purple Heart. The second review is a broader look at whether the criteria for awarding the Purple Heart is still relevant in today's battlefield, and requests your recommendations for any changes in that criteria. Mr. Secretary, I hate to get local, but this issue is very important to me. I represent Fort Hood, and the community that I represent has a keen interest in this issue. It also has significant impacts on the department. Can you provide the current status of that, the report preparation, any updates you could give, and about these reports that are due in May?
The reports are ongoing. The recommendations have not been presented to me yet. It's something that I watch very carefully. You might be aware that I have asked for a complete review of all our military decorations. In light of, I think it's just important to do that every now and then, as we've come out now, coming out our military combat action portion of the longest war we've been in Afghanistan. I think it's a smart thing, appropriate thing to do. So there is an ongoing review of all our military decorations. And this specific area that you have mentioned, because it is specifically noted in the 2014 budget, I will make I will get the recommendations. I will make a decision. We will be obviously working with the Congress on this, and we'll be in touch with you on it.
Well, we look forward to that report in May. It's important to our community. And if I may, another line of questioning here. Mr. Secretary, this budget proposes significant force reductions, particularly in the Army. Our men and women join the service with the understanding that they would be performing duties associated with their military occupational specialty, their MOS. Recently, I've heard concerns about the effect of morale of service members who are being tasked to perform duties that have nothing to do with military skills. The morale of our service members severely impacts the efficiency and performance of our military. It must be taken into consideration when seeking these efficiencies. Has this issue been brought to your attention? How do you plan to address this issue to ensure that our men and women are performing the tasks they signed up for? As DoD reduces the civilian and military workforce, as this budget proposes, can we anticipate that our service members will have to perform more of the support roles that were once conducted by a civilian workforce? And finally, what consideration, if any, does DoD give to the effects these civilian workforce reductions have on the surrounding communities around our military installations?
Judge, I'm going to respond briefly, and then I'm going to ask General Dempsey to respond to this question, because I think it's important you hear from the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff on this. First, the morale of an institution, our military, nothing more important. I'm committed to assure that. Second, we have a professional military. They don't peel potatoes anymore, like I did once, and maybe you did, when I was in the military. This is a professional group of men and women. We treat them as professionals. We ask them to undertake professional assignments that they were trained for. If there are specific examples or areas where that's not happening, I want to know about it. I know Chairman Dempsey wants to know about it. Our chiefs would want to know about it. I will do everything I can while I'm Secretary of Defense to assure that. So that would be my general commitment to you and to the people of this country and to our military. And this it won't happen as long as I'm here, but let me ask the Chairman.
Yeah, and I'll answer this briefly, and we'll follow up with you, Congressman. In adjusting to our new budget reality, we of course have had to issue guidance to the force on displacing, in some cases, contract workers. Over the last 10 years, when we had a budget where we were able to do so, for example, you might have noticed most of our installations were guarded by civilian contractors. So as we have adjusted to the new fiscal reality, the guidance has been put soldiers back into those functions, but only if they can relate to their responsibilities as, I'm using soldiers, but it's true of all the services. So one of the responsibilities of a soldier is inherently to guard things. That's what we do. And so putting soldiers back on the front gate at Fort Hood makes perfect sense and is consistent with what you'd expect of a soldier. Where there may be other things happening and we learn about them, we adjust it. But we are doing more than we did before at garrisons because we've got less money to spend to have others do it for us.
Thank you.
And I'm not saying this is happening at Fort Hood, but the question comes up, do you want an MOS of an artilleryman pushing a lawnmower? And that's why I asked the question.
Thank you, Judge.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Judge Carter. Mr. Kingston.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And to our distinguished panel, I'm sorry I'm chairing another committee right across the hall with another secretary, so apologize for going back and forth. I'll submit my questions for the record. I would be remiss in my duty representing actually every branch of the military in my district, but also particularly the Air Force and the Army. A-10s, Air Force loves them, Army lives and breathes by them, and so I wanted just to make sure you knew how the Georgia delegation feels about A-10s, and then also the proposal of the Commission for Restructuring the Air Force in regards to the Air Force Reserve Command. I'll have a question submitted to you on that, and then also potentially transitioning JSTARS to a BizJet of some sort in terms of a platform that gets them up faster. And so aside from that, I will submit the questions.
Thank you, Mr. Kingston. Mr. Visclosky.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, just want to note that the budget proposes reductions in services and strength, but notice that there is a request for Special Operations Command to receive a 10% increase over fiscal year 2014 enacted levels. Last October, the Joint Staff authorized the Special Operations Command to develop a detailed campaign plan to establish a global Special Operations Forces. It also directed that it must maximize the use of existing infrastructure and at a minimum be cost neutral and offer scalable options under reduced cost and force structures. The fiscal year 15 budget requests funding to begin new activities associated with the global SOF network vision, and also there is budgetary document language talking about obtaining the necessary authorities. The Special Forces are special. But from this member's perspective, anybody who puts on that uniform is special, and do have a very serious concern about the accretion within Special Forces, and also that everyone understands that there is a Title 10 authority for Special Forces. So want to make it very clear, and I'm again speaking for myself, I have a deep concern, understand that Admiral McRaven's coming in. We're going to have a full hearing on this issue, but just wanted you to understand my concerns. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Visclosky. On behalf of the committee, let me thank all of you for your testimony this morning and this afternoon. We focused a number of questions, and you provided answers. We have a bucket full of other questions that we would like answered on a timely basis, which go to your important work representing the world's best military. And as someone who once performed KP, I'm aware that even the man or woman on the lowest rung of the ladder is part of a remarkable team of heroes. So with that, we are adjourned. Thank you.